actually my brain immediately.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. We're going to get started. So if you would love some lovely snacks and grab those. We're going to start with a prayer. So I am going to lead us in prayer. So will you pray with me? Loving and liberating God, thank you for bringing us to this moment. Please bless this time. Please bless us as we learn. Let your Holy Spirit guide us. Give us open hearts and open minds. And above all, give us the strength to love creation and our neighbor as ourselves. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So thank you for coming to our first event as the Seminarians for Peace and Justice. This is our investment meeting, and I'm so excited that you all are here. And first we have Dr. Taylor, who's going to kind of give us a background to how we got here. So Dr. Taylor, you can take it.
Good to see everybody tonight. I will try to be good and stay within 12 minutes and easily do that. Thank you, Angel and Brooke and Neil and everybody else. Too many to name, I'm sure. I'm particularly heartened to see this new rendition of the Seminarians for Peace and Justice, SPJ, as we've called it over the years. Oh, I see Bob has worked with SPJ over the years. How great this is. He may have some memories of our organization on campus over the years, but my memory over my 40 years here goes back, this is my 40th year, by the way, goes back to the early 1990s and late 80s during the anti-apartheid struggle in the United States in support of divestment of South Africa. I don't know if you know it, back in those days, we had a camp set up outside Hodge Hall that was maintained for a few weeks. We had faculty who were designated to go in and talk to the board about what our holdings were in companies invested in South Africa that may have been in violation of the so-called Sullivan principles of investment at that time. And so this was a real important time when Seminarians for Peace and Justice, I know, were working with students and faculty, and we with the students. The students have always been the energy, the engine. You should know that for much of this. A few of us faculty have worked over the years in whatever supportive ways we could. During the sanctions era applied against Iraq in the mid-1990s, Seminarians for Peace and Justice worked with George Hunsinger and myself and Deborah Van Dusen Hunsinger, his partner, and some others to hold teach-ins about what the sanctions and our investments in the military and other corporations were doing in Iraq, taking, as I recall the number, some 500,000 children's lives, which then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said she thought was worth it. Then I remember the Seminarians for Peace and Justice surging again in the new iteration in 2002, as it was clear that the U.S. was going to go into its war and assault on Iraq, as it did in March of 2003. It built up clearly and obviously. Seminarians for Peace and Justice organized with Bob Moore's group and other groups to bring Iraqi civilians. One Iraqi civilian spoke on our campus and said what it was like to live under sanctions. And then she asked, and now you're going to proceed to bomb and invade? It was a striking moment that I'll never forget. And several of my colleagues, not only George and myself, but also Luis Rivera-Pagan, Kathleen McVeigh, and some others, actually held a press conference on campus that had some press, and Brother Luis being just received a number of threats as a result of that. So SPJ has been there at important moments. I don't remember what it has done over the last 7 to 10 years, so I was really heartened to see this this version of it focused around seminary transparency, around funds, and divestment strategies from the prison industrial complex and the military industrial complex. I'm looking for my time indication. In terms of the issue of ethical investments, to use that phrase to name some of these concerns, I remember over the years 2 forms of the issue surfacing. In one form, individual students in my class, maybe Dr. Boland has had similar experiences, want to take up the issue and not only ask about it as an issue of justice, a theological issue, but also ask our officers in administration where we are on these issues and how we think about it. It would usually issue in a paper, reporting on going in to talk to some of our financial officers. They would always run up against a certain wall and not get the information they wanted and needed, so this is a long struggle, okay, that you are taking up again and renewing for us. The second form it is taken, as I recall, and is that I think as a result of student struggle and maybe pressure from the PCUSA, which has some rather strict guidelines about ethical investments, we faculty were given an opportunity to select different ethical screens according to which we wanted funds allocated for our pension to be screened for certain ethical criteria. For example, you might choose, screen A, and it says, please withhold anything that goes to extractionist industries. Or screen B might be, please nothing that's investing in our military industrial complex. Or D might be, C might be not in any drug companies. And D might be just invest in anywhere you can and give me as much money as you can. Now, somewhere along the line, the whole idea of faculty choices of ethical screens dropped away. I don't know why. The matter died, I think, with only occasional people raising this as a problem of conscience and issues. But one story indicates that it's a concern of this place in its DNA. I remember in a faculty meeting, this is back far enough that I'm not outing anybody's political opinions, but the story consists of my remembrance of the financial officer, the board of trustees, reporting on budget matters, and then saying as an aside, by the way, we've maintained our commitment in not investing in industries of tobacco and alcohol. And one of my savvy and quick colleagues to my right raised his hand and said, well, how about in the weapons industry? She didn't know. She wasn't prepared for the question of divestment to take that step. She said she would go find out, but she never got back to us. I think I need to just say, and I think we all acknowledge this, that this problem is one we are all in. None of us are pure. I mean, any of us have a salary or a fellowship or a grant or supported in any way by this institution. We are in the very corporate imperial structure that we are opposing. We just have to admit that and live and embrace that contradiction, but that doesn't mean we accept the contradiction. We still fight it. We name the imperialism. We name the inequalities. We name the rip-off procedures that are underway in both the prison industrial complex, the detention industrial complex, and more. I just wanted to make sure I get within, as my time is running out here, the point that this concern about these industries making money off of imprisoned bodies or bombed bodies or incarcerated bodies, this isn't just an ideological commitment. Practitioners at the executive level and the corporate planning levels know what they're doing. They do. They count on on setting things up in a way that makes a profit. Here's one example that was so good I had to put it in my book. It's a paragraph about a core civic executive writing in 2014 about detention and detention facilities. He says the demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by the relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency in conviction or parole standards and sentencing practices, or through the decriminalization of certain activities that are currently proscribed by criminal laws. For instance, any changes with respect to drugs and controlled substances or illegal immigration could affect the number of persons arrested, convicted, and sentenced, thereby potentially reducing demand for correctional facilities to house them. Legislation has been proposed in numerous jurisdictions that could lower minimum sentences for some nonviolent crimes and make more inmates eligible for early release based on good behavior. With the tone is definitely, we wouldn't want that. It's a report to his board. This, of course, is nothing new. Back in 1948, in a top secret memo, maybe many of you remember George Kennan writing that, in his terms, quote, "We have only 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of the population." In that kind of context, he says that we are going to need to know how to defend what we have and to defend the disparity. He says we need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. Close quote. And indeed, they have done that through doctrines of full spectrum dominance. We have been defending what we have in inordinate inequality of power and wealth. And I am happy that this organization, this new iteration of Seminaries for Peace and Justice, are undertaking the long struggle, the long task, but in a new way, in a powerful way, it looks like to me. The planners were impressive. I came early and I watched them at work, and I haven't quite seen this level of intensity. So thank you for this work, and thank you for this night. I'm within my time, right? Okay, thank you.
Hello. Char's going to try to figure out what's going on with this, and I'm just going to keep talking because we want to respect your time. I'm Brooke. I'm the chaplain for SPJ and one of the founding members, and I just wanted to briefly connect us to a larger divestment movement that is going on right now. So when this began two years ago, the summer of 2020, some of us were following a student movement across the country. Georgetown was one of the first we saw, for example, divesting from the prison industrial complex. And we looked at different schools asking for divestment. Spirit and Divest Princeton are some of our own here at the university, and they're in our link tree if you want to take a look at them. And we wanted to start something dedicated to our endowment. So we expanded our focus to include the military and prison industrial complex and the fossil fuel industry, because we saw those three industries as particularly concerning to us. We joined under this new student group name because of the old student group's history, as Dr. Hiller has just given us, and we wanted to organize specifically around intentional leftist politics. So why transparency? Why are we asking for transparency instead of directly divestment? So we chose to ask for transparency because even though it seems vague, we still don't really know what the seminary is invested in. The way it works, what we learned after meeting with some people, is that PTS partners with investment firms or investors who put PTS's money into various holdings. Some of the investors make their holdings transparent to PTS's investment office, and others do not. Thus, PTS does not know all of the business their endowment holdings are in. So now that we have this updated information, we wanted to reintroduce, hence this event, our old petition that kind of made its rounds about a year ago. And we have that in our link tree. Char will introduce that again here at the end. So here's what we know about the current endowment. The investment office is in a peculiar position because the seminary has not made clear their values or guidelines for investments and holdings. We all feel suspicious, and I know other people outside of the group have shared their suspicions as well, thinking that the board might not care about these things given that the CEO of General Dynamics has a seat on the board. We're not confident that they care about matters of the PIC or the MIC or the fossil fuel industry. And as such, the investment office does not see it as necessary for their office to come up with said guidelines. Rather, they said that they hope the seminary executive and board members could develop investment guidelines and protocols. So we believe the seminary board and executive committee need to be pressed to create guidelines for the investment holdings. The investment office, as it stands, has little to no prerogative to invest ethically. We met with the VP of Endowment Investments, and he expressed a willingness to work with us on these matters, but did not feel that the board or the seminary leadership had prompted him to care about ethical investing, even though, as Dr. Taylor mentioned, there is such a thing as the PCUSA guidelines for ethical investing. So the investment office is aware of the PCUSA's guidelines for ethical investing, but they said they do not, or the VP of Investments said they do not follow them because they are too restrictive, hence our concern. So in summary, we do not know all the holdings, neither does PTS, which we see as a problem. So we're asking that they become transparent. We'll give you more when we introduce the petition on what exactly we mean when we say transparent, or where they can't just publish necessarily every single thing they're invested in online. But we want to do this so that we can ensure we are not invested in unethical institutions, particularly as our concerns state the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, and fossil fuel industry. And next we'll have people explain more what we mean when we use those terms. Thanks.
Thank you for your patience, everyone. So we just wanted to, I'm Emma. I'm Delaney. And we are going to just talk really briefly about divestment campaigns, divesting from the fossil fuel industry, and why that's sort of important component of the presentation. We wanted to begin with a little bit of history about campaigns of divestment from fossil fuel industries. I just thought it would be important to bring up a few relevant dates. So, I just wanted to remind everybody that Exxon has known about climate change and the effects of its activities since 1977, when Exxon conducted independent science, and the issue was first raised. At that time, it was estimated that they had about 10 years to come up with alternative energy solutions. A decade later, in the 80s, Congress held the first congressional hearing on global warming, and in that same decade, Exxon and other fossil fuel industry players helped to create the Global Climate Coalition, which intentionally kind of launched these campaigns of disinformation to get people looking not at the root causes of the problem, but to kind of distract them. So if you've heard of the carbon footprint, that's an idea that was created by British Petroleum to get people more concerned about the impacts of their individual choices in the climate conversation than on the players who are benefiting most from ecological destruction. So when we talk about divesting from the fossil fuel industry, we're talking about taking money away from these bad actors who have not proven to be trustworthy in the past. And then Delaney's going to talk a little bit about recent movements in the divestment world.
Yeah, hi. So I came to this issue. I'm coming to SPJ and the specific conversation more recently, but the conversation about divestment, specifically fossil fuel divestment, is one that I've spent almost 10 years now working in. In 2012, when Bill McKibben's 350.org movement kind of set the stage for the divestment campaign, they visited Seattle. A group of my friends were at that event, and in 2013, I joined a campaign at our school, Seattle University, my alma mater, to encourage the school to invest in fossil fuels. Some background on that campaign, my school only just, in 2018, agreed to partial divestment, so that gives you a timeline. It was 5 years of organizing, 2 years after I graduated. This is why building up student orders is really important long term. In 2020, they're actually 9 months ahead of the schedule that the board has agreed to, so that's great news. But it does take persistence, it takes a lot of effort. This is a complicated campaign. We're throwing a lot at you. This is part of how we dance around these issues and try to be light in the face of, no one having a pure position. So 2012, Bill McKibben. The other important date that we wanted to recognize is 2015. There's both in Seattle, a growing divestment campaign amongst Seattle University, SPU, with both religious institutions, as well as University of Washington. At the same time, there's growing efforts around Greenpeace and some other kind of direct action organizations. And you might have heard about the Shell Arctic drilling, maybe not. There were direct campaigns, they're called kayaktivists, blocking oil rigs that were, you might have seen it, positioned in the Puget Sound, ready to head up to the Arctic to continue a Shell drilling campaign there. Those kayaktivists, combined with the people power of people who've been in the divestment movement, other climate justice organizations, were able to stop Shell from pursuing that Arctic drilling. So that project ended up being abandoned. There's a lot of economic kind of levels to that decision on their part, but part of that is divestment and the continued work of activists to make this not profitable for them.
Just something to highlight and give you a little context in the movement. So it's been just 10 years since the first institution publicly divested from fossil fuels that was an educational institution in Maine. And as of today, there are 1,485 institutions representing $39 trillion in assets that have committed to divest from fossil fuels. And the relevant point I wanted to bring up is that most of those, about 1/3, are faith institutions, communities of faith, including the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, and others. And then about 15% are educational institutions, including Harvard University and most Ivy Leagues. As was mentioned already, Princeton University is still kind of in the midst of a legal battle. The case for divesting from fossil fuels. What we're kind of after is, in Bill McKibben's words, is revoking the social license of the fossil fuel industry. So sending a signal to say, it's not okay to continue to pursue these projects, which put our collective future at risk. When you think about fossil fuel infrastructure, we're thinking about climate impacts way down the line. So the way that climate systems work is that the climate impacts we're seeing today are the result of actions taken decades ago. And this is where we are now. So whenever infrastructure is built, we're kind of securing a more chaotic climate future for our children. What we know is that that countries have plans for development that put us way beyond the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees average of global planet warming. And what that means is past pre-industrial levels, so 1.5 degrees Celsius on average, warmer than, yes, you guys know that. Yeah, and then as a community of faith, we should care about the environmental justice implications of fossil fuel infrastructure, which includes not only oil rigs and mining operations, but also the infrastructure that's necessary to refine that oil and transport that oil, which disproportionately affects communities of color and low-income communities who are kind of bearing the brunt of the costs already in terms of their kind of higher rates of cancer, asthma, and other respiratory diseases. And then we wanted to really briefly mention some of the kind of arguments for and against. This, as was mentioned already, this conversation can be a little bit confusing, and there can be a little bit of finger pointing that gets us distracted from, again, the root causes at issue. Do you want to talk about this?
Sure. Yes, keep talking about it. Yeah, so one really frequent one is that
We know that. Yeah.
yeah.
So
the first one being that climate change, individual action is more important than, and it's all we can do, I guess, is more the narrative, that we can only control our own actions, and so why don't you get an electric car, or look at your own, retirement account, things like that. And the reality is we are all in this collective problem, and we need mass mobilization and collective action. It is a distraction and a diversion tactic meant to distract us again from root causes.
And furthermore, we believe that institutions who have historically benefited the most from these activities of extraction have the most responsibility in the present day. But we also wanted to talk really briefly in the minute that we have left about this idea that divesting from fossil fuels is a bad stewardship move if we're talking about financial stewardship, or that we assume the risk of financial loss by divesting from fossil fuel and related industries. We know from the last decade of this movement that that's not the case, and institutions who have committed to fossil fuel divestment early on show very little to even kind of positive returns on those alternative investments. Is there anything else you wanted to say? There are arguments? Risk? Talk about that? All right. I think we're good. Thank you.
So I am going to talk briefly about the military and prison industrial complexes as systems, and then why we should be concerned about divesting from those set systems. So the military industrial complex is this kind of intertangling of different systems. It kind of refers to the connection between like private weapons manufacturing and nations' war programs. And because of military forces kind of being funded by our national governments, there are all of these different kind of companies and things engaged in the act of making war. So it isn't just that like you go to the Pentagon and they are that is the one. The military itself is the thing producing war and kind of advancing the nation's interests. It's kind of an intertangling of private companies alongside the military apparatus itself, and the companies that produce the things that are used to wage war. And basically, all of the suppliers, all of the people engaged in producing each and every kind of aspect of the situation, thank you all for being very understanding with our technical difficulties. All of these different elements that you see on here in this kind of little infographic, they all are connected in this complex. So it isn't just that there's like one aspect to this system that must be addressed. It is a whole entanglement that has a lot to do with finances and investments and where what these companies have in their funds, and how not just the government is involved, but different bureaucrats and people leading companies like General Dynamics that end up being the kind of signs of or the symbols of imperialism abroad. And so really what we are trying to address with the military industrial complex is that it is a system that relies on not just the exploitation of people's bodies as they're fighting and waging war, but it is also the supplies and materials, and it also exploits the land in order to make all of these weapons and all of these bombs and these things that end up also having their own devastating effects. And the fact that there are so many companies that just profit off of almost seamlessly profit off of the lack of they profit off of making war. It is very imperative for us as a theological institution who says that we follow the gospel of Jesus Christ to be concerned with these systems, especially as it has a major effect, whether we like to think about it or not, on the infrastructure of our world and where money gets invested in. And so as you see in the infographic, there are all of these kind of little, there are all of these different connections made between, the government apparatus itself, the military, the media, defense contractors, other corporations, Wall Street, you name it, it is all kind of intertangled in this one system. And the importance of divesting from the system is because how can you, if you ever want to have peace, why would you want to invest in anything that makes war and produces violence, right? So now I'm going to talk a bit more about the prison industrial complex, which you might have heard a lot about in recent years because of films like Ava DuVernay's 13th, or books like The New Jim Crow. There are many kind of new burgeoning, well, this has been an issue for a long time, but there's a burgeoning kind of field of interest in researching and reflecting how we got to where we are with regards to mass incarceration. And so the prison industrial complex is also a kind of multifaceted system of overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. And so this isn't just like a new development where it was just like, suddenly it was 2022 and we have the prison industrial complex. This goes back to the root of where prisons came from to begin with, right? And so if you look at this historically, the prison system is rooted in chattel slavery. The first police forces were, slave patrols, right? And so there is this way that, if you look back and look at how slave patrols, that leading into the Jim Crow era, you have convict leasing, where incarcerated people were used as labor for other private companies. Their labor was exploited for these companies, right? And then you can fast forward to the war on drugs, in the 1980s, and you see this growing number of people being surveilled, and people being over-policed, and people being over-arrested in mass amounts. And that ends up being used, right? When you're incarcerated, you often have to work for pennies a day in order to make money for companies or make products for companies like Victoria's Secret, or Walmart or Target or Amazon, right? And so the kind of roots of mass incarceration are directly connected to racism and directly connected to the policing of Black and brown bodies and peoples, and also very much tied to labor and the work that people are made to do. And the prison industrial complex isn't just confined to the prison itself, it is also rooted within the school to prison pipeline, right? Because then you have police in schools, right? Who are, I don't know about you, but in my high school, we had police officers there who would arrest kids if they showed up to school and did whatever infraction that they did. And then very quickly you would see that mass amounts of children, of young, usually Black and brown kids, would then go into juvenile detention and then go into actual prison. And when you also think about it, there are many instances in many Black and brown communities where you will see a school right next to a prison, or down the street from a prison, right? And so it's like they're making it very clear that these connections are there. So it doesn't have to be that it's the physical walls of the prison that is the system. The system is going into all of these other facets of life. And when you think about the cases of police brutality and the instances that you see on social media and all of that, what happens to people when they get arrested or put on bail, only to be arrested and harassed again, only to violate parole or something, and then go back into the system, back and forth and back and forth. All of those things are really made out of the profit of, it's for the profit of the system. And I am not going to cover this at length, but I also think it was important to bring up detention centers and how they are also a key aspect of the prison industrial complex. I myself have family that are detained, and it is prison. It is a whole section of these detention centers that profit off of filling their beds, right, with actual people, because they aren't, American, right? And what happens is also that even in the prison and even in the detention center, when you are there, you also have to buy stuff, right? You have to purchase stuff. You have commissary. You have to call your family. You have other needs and things that you need to buy. And all of those things are overcharged by ridiculous amounts, which then makes it so that people end up in situations where they're spending whatever little money that they make and in debt to the prison itself that is profiting off of their body. And so really when we're talking about the military industrial complex and the prison industrial complex and how it connects to divestment, it's because if we were to do that, not only as a theological kind of statement towards following Christ, but it would look like taking things that are used for exploitation, taking money and funds that are used for exploitation of people's bodies, of their lives, of their families, and putting that money into other things that could actually serve those communities, rather than putting them in the cycle of exploitation. And divesting from the prison industrial complex and the military industrial complex is an act of solidarity against a fundamentally racist system. It is a fundamentally, it is a race issue. The issues of the military industrial complex and prison industrial complex are fundamentally grounded in racism. And so if you want to be anti-racist, and if you consider yourself such, then you naturally should be interested in the divestment from these systems. And that concludes
That ending, I think, is a great segue into our next section, which is theological reasons to be about divestment. This Bible verse that's on the front of your bulletin, this verse from Jeremiah 8:11, "They have treated the wound of my people carelessly, saying, 'Peace, peace,' when there is no peace." Just like Angel said, if we say that we are anti-racist, that is a value of ours, we have to actually live that out in embodied ways and think critically about the systems that we're involved in, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And this whole topic of divestment speaks to all these different areas that are real values of ours, but they come in the world in forms that aren't necessarily defined with the language that we tend to use. Peace, for example, when we talk about the military, we talk about prisons. We may say that we are about peace, but then think of these issues that have sociological, political, economic names as being very different from what we're talking about, but they are so integrated. As a theological institution that says we're about Jesus and his ministry of love and justice, we have to make sure that our life on this campus is not causing harm to people. If we say that we're about peace, and yet we receive financial aid through money that was earned by investments in institutions that harm and enslave and kill people, we are not being about the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that's simply a fact. It's really difficult to grapple with. And it's certainly not simple or easy, but it is the truth that we're not about peace if we're learning about God through harm. So I thought that I would take us through a few Bible verses and a quote as kind of a starting off point for talking about these things. And struggling for the least of these and for their liberation. If we were to take the politics of Jesus seriously, we as a student group and as a seminary have to take a stand against the powers of capitalism, imperialism, and war. I love the book of Amos so much. Here's chapter 5, verses 21 through 24. I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fattened animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. I think that one of the things that is really in play here for us as students at a theological institution is that learning about God and being part of God's activity in the world are very interconnected. They are not separate things. And so to be learning about God and doing our field education, worshiping God in all different areas of our life, that's not disconnected from the investments of this institution in these harmful systems in our world. Those are not disconnected in any way, and I think that this passage from Amos really speaks to that. That religious practice, while also being complicit and participating in systems that exploit people, it's not acceptable to the Lord. And that personally is hard for me to come to terms with, as we all are putting so much effort into our learning here. And it's hard to think that all of the progress that we're making and all of the empathy that we're developing in some way is still incompatible with God's activity in the world. I don't entirely know how to put that together, but being about divestment is very important and is essential for our theological education. I think that's reflected in this quote as well. God's activity in the world, as was said in Isaiah and as Jesus quoted in Luke, is about setting captives free, setting prisoners free, recovery of sight to the blind, those who've been harmed, letting the oppressed go free, proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor. That is what God's activity in the world looks like. If we are going to be participating in the divine life, we have to be doing those things as well. Gustavo Gutierrez, I think, puts that very nicely when he said, reflection on the mystery of God can only be undertaken if we follow in the steps of Jesus. Only if we walk in the way of the Spirit is it possible to understand and announce the gratuitous love of the Father for all people. If we really want to be learning about God at this institution, we have to be about divestment. Our well-being is connected with that of everybody in this world. People are being harmed all the time with our investments that we're getting financial aid from. We're connected to them. We're not separate from them. And our education is not separate from them. We need to be about what we say we're about. The financial office here talks about good stewardship a lot. And my question to them would be stewardship for whom? For whose benefit? Is it for the benefit of us as students receiving large financial aid packages? Or is it for the benefit of everyone in this world that we might all live in peace and safety with dignity and flourishing? We all want to affect change, but are we willing to be affected? The fact is that being about divestment and being about justice will take a hit to the finances of students. The school will not have as much money to provide financial aid to people, but is participating in God's activity in the world and the justice and safety and well-being of everyone more important to us than our financial aid packages? It's a difficult question, but I hope you will wrestle with it with us.
All right, thank you to all of our presenters so far, and thank you to all of you who are here. You have just been sitting through a ton of powerful information, probably a lot that you are already familiar with, and hopefully some stuff that was new for you today. It's been a passive form of receiving, and now I want to invite you into an active engagement. And so I imagine most of you have one of these cellular devices. If you can pull it out now, I want to invite you to go to your Instagram. If you don't have an Instagram, there is a link. Hopefully there's someone in the crowd who's still holding out. Then I want to provide you with a link. So if you go to Seminarians for Peace and Justice, that's the pts.spj of our Instagram account. If you can pull that out now. And if not, if you can go to this link. So that's linktr.ee/seminarians, the numeral 4, peace.justice. Please raise your hand if you need to get that link again. Otherwise, in the Instagram, is everyone able to find the Instagram page? All right, if you see the link tree, at the top of the link tree, once you click it, there is a link to our petition. So I invite you to open up the petition with me now. A petition is the way that we as students who make up the numbers, we are the power, we are the voice of this community. We might not hold the authority of a certain office, but we are who the institution is driven from when we recognize that power. And so if we push back and hold the institution accountable, we have the power to make a change. There's much information on here in the petition, some of which we've already covered, but I want to focus on a theme of transparency, as Brooke brought up at the beginning. There was a team of 3 of us, Neil, Nicole, and I, who met with the VP of Princeton's Endowment Affairs a couple days ago. And we were discussing with him our hope for transparency, and he was communicating some of the difficulty involved with this, in that PTS has their endowment held by various investors who themselves are doing all the investment for us. So it's a step removed, and PTS doesn't even have all of the information. Now that makes it all the more incumbent on the institution to hold their investors accountable. And it makes it incumbent upon us to hold PTS accountable for that process. And so that's the transparency that we are demanding, that they would know that we are holding them accountable. And so in our petition here, down at the bottom, we express some of these points, some of our demands upon the institution. The first point here, disclosing Princeton Theological Seminary's investments and divesting from corporations profiting from the PIC, MIC, fossil fuels, and establishing a body to ensure its endowment is ethically invested. This is where we will come in, that we are hoping to have faculty, admin, students involved in a team that is holding Princeton accountable for their investments. To require this new body to host open meetings and release regular, publicly verifiable reports to measure its progress in divestment. And then from the information from this process of accountability, as the seminary holds their investors accountable, that they would dissolve all formal contracts, relationships, and partnerships with companies that profit from the MIC, the PIC, and fossil fuel industry. And then finally, to pledge to never in the future invest in the MIC, PIC, and fossil fuel industry, and to meet yearly divestment goals with external bodies to monitor progress and to publish reports ensuring transparency. All of this and more is available on our petition. I ask that you would sign this petition to endorse the work that we are doing here. I also encourage you to check out the other links that we have available in our Linktree. There's plenty of good information there. And at the bottom of the Linktree page, there's a little icon with a mail. If you are not yet signed up for the Seminaries for Peace and Justice in our mailing list, if you click that little button there and you just send a quick email saying add me, it'll be very easy for us to rope you into the work that we're doing. Finally, as you are involved and you get to hear back from us as we have more events, I encourage you to come and participate with us in our future events. Your voice is also powerful on social media in the way that you engage. The seminary does hear that, and so we have a hashtag available that we encourage you to share, Transparent PTS. So whenever you're thinking about it, maybe you're taking a nice shower, your thoughts are up, and how we can be involved in justice, and you think, oh, right, the endowment. You can make a post where you acknowledge that we are not yet transparent, and this is the hope for our community. So these are some ways that you as a community can be involved. Now I want to invite up those of you who have presented the team, and we will have a time for questions and answers. So you can ask questions about some of the information we presented. You can ask questions about the process, about the petition, any point of curiosity. This is your moment. Yes?
I'm just curious if Angel and Emily and whoever else could talk on, you mentioned briefly the detainment facilities, and I was interested if you could talk on the relationship between climate change, the fossil fuel industry, climate refugees, and the right's response to climate change via large security state investments in detainment facilities. So I guess could you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a lot. But I think with regards to how these facilities kind of are connected to climate in particular, the production of, there's a recent report that I had read that had said that, and I will have to find the actual report, but the U.S. military is one of the largest sources of pollution in the world. It produces the sheer amount of energy that is used, and the gas and all the things to have tanks and trucks and things all over the world, and how that the kind of production of bombs and missiles and different things requires also like extraction from the ground and from different specific materials that are kind of rare materials and things like that, it ends up having this very negative effect on the environment, as well as having negative effects when things happen and people or communities are bombed, right? If you look at in Vietnam and Laos and other areas within Asia and in certain places of Africa, if you look at Yemen, the entire cities and countries are like devastated. And if you look at, I think in Laos in particular, there's a ton of bombs that are still like present in the ground that go off occasionally still, right? And there are in numerous areas effects of the gases and things used in war that not only harm people but harm the environment. And so there is a connection, a very strong connection between the military-industrial complex and the environment. I think with regards to detention centers and prisons, I couldn't remember what the other points you were asking, but I think something that is important to know is that with these institutions, like it doesn't just have human harms that it causes, but think about how land is used, right? Think about what it looks like to construct certain buildings in certain areas. I know, like in Philly, where I was living, there was like they made a detention center right downtown, right? So, like, what does that do to the landscape, to the infrastructure of a city, of a community? What does that do to the resources that end up being used to maintain larger and larger facilities? That there's a lot of things that are being used for things and stuff like that. Yeah, please.
Because I think your question is specifically talking about climate policy or climate refugees and immigration policy. Because I think the link, it sounds like your question kind of have a guess about this with the current, infrastructure, legal infrastructure, criminal legal infrastructure, like detention facilities, actual material facilities, disproportionately criminalize immigration from places where people are currently most impacted by climate disruption. And so we can see how a immigration refugee crisis in Europe is being treated very differently than pre-existing refugee crises that are ongoing, that are in some ways related to climate.
Yeah, and I think like there are several of the cities in the global south that are going to go underwater, are going to result in a refugee crisis of numbers that are completely unprecedented, and that the West is not prepared to deal with. And I feel like if they do deal with it, they will deal with it through the ways that they know how, which is further criminalization and further, trying to make a profit out of a tragedy, right? And I think with climate policy, also something that I think that is very important is that there is and has been ways of discourse and talking about climate change that, and how people talk about just environmentalism in general, that doesn't have this kind of intersectional analysis of how it impacts communities, specifically like communities of color, and communities that are not in the West and that are not in the global South. I think that's also really important to note that like there is a way in which also discourse around environmentalism and some of what Delaney and Emma were alluding to earlier, like the individualizing of talking about environmentalism and like trying to make change also ends up in many ways kind of blaming oftentimes poor communities of color for individual choices that are such because of systemic and purposeful reasons, right? It's like not everyone is going to buy sustainable, cups or whatever it is. If you live in a food desert with very limited access to a Target, a Walmart, or whatever, so then if you're going to, criticize people for not having for drinking out of a plastic straw or whatever, and not thinking about how the plastic straws are still being produced, and the choice of judging people who don't have access to buy the things that are kind of being used as the solutions to climate and change and conservation and stuff. There's a way that gets used, and that rhetoric is kind of harmful. And so kind of be mindful of that, of how people talk about those things, instead of looking at the way that the system is set up to perpetuate things. Because it's why are you going to be mad at someone for taking the bus instead of buying a hybrid? Because they don't have the money to buy a hybrid, Yeah.
Structural solutions to structural problems.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing with the president.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
Do we have time for another question? Time for, okay. Any other questions? Go ahead.
So, my question is, do you guys have any advice on how to practically, in the small ways that we are invested as individuals in society, how do we kind of start that process of divestment? Even as, I know for myself, I'm a student, I don't really have that many investments in anything, in terms of place, geology, even financially. So, how do I approach the next couple of years where we are told to invest, or else you're not going to be able to retire, and we're told to, all these kind of the systems that are told to support us? How do we engage with those systems in ways that do not encourage this problem to continue to happen?
A couple notes. One, I think that solidarity is a really important kind of foundational concept for us. And there are many